You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, and Lisa Watson is on the buttons, and we're getting ready to speak with Dr. Gerald Horne, the Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. And he has many books. And we are going to, when I say many books, I need to talk about his latest book, which is about capital. What is the name of your new book, sir?
Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865, at better bookstores everywhere.
And there's so much going on. I am really getting, there's too much going on in the world, because I really wanted to talk to you about, there's a report from the Hindustan Times talking about Pakistan blames India for suicide car bomb attack. New Delhi responds with contempt. I guess that is the most burning issue that we can begin with.
Well, this situation is not going away anytime soon. Although I noted with interest the fact that just this past week, there was a very important meeting of defense ministers from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is fair to suggest should be viewed as a counterpoint of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization led by Daddy Trump. And interestingly, at this defense minister meeting in China, the defense ministers of India and Pakistan were both present, not to mention the defense minister of Iran. And of course, Iran has the most to gain from that particular session. But my understanding is that India was disappointed with the communique that was issued, which should not be surprising, because many of India's comrades are upset with New Delhi because of its leaning towards Israel during the recent conflict between Israel and Iran, whereas Pakistan apparently leaned towards Iran. I say apparently because there was an unverified report that I noticed that said that just before June 12th, June 13th, when Israel launched this piratical attack, the head of the Pakistani military gave an expensive watch to his counterpart in Iran. And subsequently, on that infamous Friday the 13th, he was slain by Israeli agents. And it's suspected that his watch helped to provide the coordinates to the Israeli agents that allowed him to be slain. Now, I cannot verify that particular story, but it is floating in the ether. I should also mention, as I think I did a week or so ago, that strangely enough, that same head of the military, during the height of the Israeli attacks on Iran, met at the White House with one Donald J. Trump. Now, at the time, it was thought that that meeting had been arranged well in advance and that it was coincidental that it happened at the time of the Israeli bombardment of Iran. But I'm not so sure in retrospect, although on the other side of the ledger, I should mention the fact that during the height of that war of aggression, the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, called that he was president during the Obama years, during the time that Mr. Putin was stepping down to become prime minister, that Medvedev suggested in a social media post that attracted the negative attention of Mr. Trump that Iran's friends might very well supply Iran with a nuclear weapon if Iran asked for it. And it was suspected that the friend was not necessarily Russia, with which, to be fair, Iran has complicated relations with Russia, but the friend was the bordering nation that is Pakistan. So there is a lot to chew over with regard to India-Pakistan relations, to Pakistan-Iran relations, and I should also mention that also during the height of the bombardment, the Pakistani government nominated Donald J. Trump to win a Nobel Prize for Peace, which of course he is campaigning for, crusading for, lusting for, in addition to having his visage carved on Mount Rushmore, that infamous mountain in the Dakotas where U.S. presidents thought to be renowned or have their visage permanently emplaced on Native American land. Mr. Trump says he wants his face to be carved into Mount Rushmore. So I'm not sure what to make of this latest report from Pakistan, although I think this does open the door for us to give an assessment of what Mr. Trump has called the 12-day war, beginning June 12th, June 13th, concluding roughly June 24th, June 25th. I think after perusing the U.S. press, they presented a distorted viewpoint of the winners and losers of this conflict. Israel had the Weizmann Institute virtually destroyed, a cyber park that housed Microsoft and I think Google as well, virtually destroyed. Mossad, the equivalent of the Israeli CIA headquarters, virtually destroyed. 40,000 claims by Israeli nationals for property damage. That's much more than those claims that have been filed since October 7, 2023, with the action by Hamas from Gaza into southern Israel. I think it's also fair to say that Israel bit off more than it could chew. We had been led to believe that the plot involved destroying Iranian nuclear capability. Mr. Trump has claimed that that capability has been obliterated. But here's where it gets tricky, because after he made those statements, there were leaks from Pentagon intelligence that suggested that was inaccurate. But what's tricky is the fact that the neocons who dominate in security, the security establishment to this very day in Washington, would like to float the story. The job was not finished so that they can relaunch another attack against Iran. And don't be surprised if another attack is relaunched sooner rather than later. Indeed, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz has suggested as much. So this is an ongoing story. It's also interesting to note as well, and this may be one of the most important events of late June 2025, is that in the midst of this controversy concerning the Israeli piratical attack on Iran, you had the Democratic primary for mayor in New York City, and emerging triumphant, apparently, is Kwame Mamdani, that is to say, a man born in Uganda, raised partially in South Africa, of South Asian parentage. His father, Mahmoud Mamdani, is a leading Africanist scholar, some renown. His mother, Mira Nair, is an Indian filmmaker. I recommend her film with Denzel Washington, Mississippi Masala, amongst others. And how this ties into the previous story is that Mayor-in-Waiting Mamdani has pledged and promised that he will arrest Benjamin Netanyahu the next time he's in New York, and presumably bundle him off to the International Criminal Court to stand trial for war crimes. Mr. Mamdani was a founder of Students for Justice in Palestine at his alma mater, Bowdoin College in Maine. You may recall that Bowdoin College also produced John Russwurm of Jamaican and Quebecois heritage, who founded Freedom's Journal the leading Black American publication in 1827. It's interesting to note as well that despite his credentials and his pedigree, Mr. Mamdani did not receive a majority of Black American votes. I think that would be remedied. But at the same time, I say remedied because, of course, there's a general election in November before he becomes mayor. And the incumbent mayor, Mayor Eric Adams, the former cop, corruption and scandal ridden, has had, shall we say, a very curious relationship with many of our Black nationalist friends in Southeast Queens and in Brooklyn. And it's going to be very intriguing to watch how they take positions in the run-up to this election. Now, it's interesting to note that the mainstream politicians, including Hakeem Jeffries, the nephew of Professor Leonard Jeffries, formerly of the City College of New York, and the Speaker of the House in waiting, he has congratulated Mamdani on his victory, but has yet to endorse him. It'll be interesting to see if he and other establishment Democrats endorse the Democratic nominee to lead City Hall. So the plot thickens, in other words, and in light of what I have just suggested, it may be possible to suggest that we're living through a change in the global correlation of forces, and most importantly, the domestic correlation of forces in the United States of America. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Recall that it was in 1943 that a Black communist, Ben Davis Jr., was elected to the New York City Council, reelected in 1945, but in jail by 1950, 1951. So this ruling class that we face in the United States of America is quite wily, quite ruthless, and already they're lining up behind Eric Adams, including Bill Ackman, who needs to be investigated. And I say that because this pro-Zionist billionaire not only helped to engineer the ouster of Claudine Gay, the first Black woman president of Harvard University, because of her dearth of enthusiasm concerning Israel in light of October 7, 2023, but he has been accused credibly of playing the Zionist card for profit. He has been accused credibly of suggesting that Nike, the athletic shoe manufacturer headquartered in the state of Oregon, he accused them of anti-Semitism, and then at the same time began to short their stock. That is to say, betting that the price of the stock would fall, which would then allow him to reap a profit. So there's a lot to investigate with regard to what's going on both domestically in the United States and globally. And let me make one more point before I return the microphone to you, which is that, as you know, I'm here in Canada, so I've been reading the Toronto Globe and Mail on a regular basis. And it has struck me, particularly in recent days, that some of the opinion writers in the Globe and Mail are not necessarily connecting all the dots with regard to Mr. Trump's challenge to Canadian sovereignty. That is to say, you have opinion writers in the Globe and Mail who routinely and ritualistically attack the U.S. left, for example. And yet, it's the U.S. left who are most likely to come to the defense of Canadian sovereignty, not to mention the fact that the U.S. left are the opponents of Mr. Trump. And you would think that he would be saluting the opponents of Mr. Trump in order to undermine Mr. Trump. But I think what that bespeaks is that at times there are those who are not sufficiently aware and sophisticated to recognize that the ground beneath their feet has moved, and therefore you have to adjust your ideology, if not your talking points. In other words, some of these opinion writers in the Toronto Globe and Mail are not necessarily aware that the 1990s line of attacking the U.S. left and ritualistically bashing them is not necessarily the correct approach in 2025 in the age of Daddy Trump.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. And before I turn it over to Melinda Francis, I wanted to say that I wrote for the Globe and Mail at one point, and the Globe and Mail, to be perfectly honest, they are the cheapest. At least they pay you the less because they say your articles are going to be read in the embassies in China and the embassies in Nairobi and da 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 da. But I would be saying to myself, yeah, but that doesn't pay my rent. And I got fired from the Globe and Mail because I wrote a column about a review of Malcolm X's book, and he criticized Zionism, and I was out of the door. And and I have one other question. Could you elaborate on Pakistan's, the relationship of Pakistan to Africa and its diaspora?
Well, it depends on what you construct the diaspora as being. I mean, for example, Mamdani is also a Muslim, and his roots go back to British India, as it was called pre-1947, and to an extent goes back to what you might call Pakistan. Now, unlike, for example, United Arab Emirates, which we've been reporting on vigorously in recent weeks, which has been playing a very malignant role in Sudan, I would also argue in the Sahel nations, etc. We cannot necessarily say that's true with regard to Pakistan. So Pakistan is a very curious country. It has a very close relationship with the People's Republic of China. Recall that during the Cold War, the lineup was Pakistan and China confronting India and the then Soviet Union. Recall that Pakistan formerly included what is now Bangladesh. That is to say, you had these two predominantly Muslim nations at one time, approximately a half century ago, on the west side of India. That's Pakistan today, and on the east side, speaking of Bangladesh. So it's a very curious development indeed, and certainly is something that we're going to have to monitor quite carefully, because with Mayor Mamdani in waiting, and I expect him to prevail, although there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, there is going to be enormous pressure on City Hall, on Mayor Mamdani. There's going to be a lot of scheming and deviltry on the part of certain mainstream Black politicians, starting with Hakeem Jeffries of Brooklyn, Gregory Meeks of Southeast Queens, for example, to begin with. And so all that means is that we're going to have to step up our game. We're going to have to become more alert and more intelligent in how we approach not only domestic politics, but global politics. Because when Mr. Mamdani won, and by the way, I called him Z Kwame Mamdani because his middle name is Kwame after Kwame Nkrumah. Of course, he's better known as Zoran Mamdani. His victory was front page news in Pakistan and in India. Although I understand that some of the Hindu chauvinists in India who have their followers in North America were not necessarily enthused by the victory of Mr. Mamdani because of the Islamophobia that oftentimes characterizes the BJP, the ruling party, Prime Minister Modi in New Delhi. And we're going to have to keep a close and careful eye on that as well. I understand that Mr. Mamdani has beefed up his security, which I think is quite reasonable. And I should also say, for those interested in further exploring his background, look at some of his videos. He's a decade or so ago, he was a budding rapper. And apparently he did some raps in Kampala, Uganda, where he was born, which are quite intriguing, by the way.
Well, let me say that Hakeem Jeffrey's name is, his first name is Sekou, after, I don't know if he was named after Sekou Touré of Guinea. I wouldn't be surprised. Ahmed Sekou Touré, yeah, but Melinda's turn to burn.
Yeah, did we want to talk about the bunker busters in Syria?
Well, first of all, the bunker busters. Well, actually, first of all, Syria, because that's a shorter news item. While understandably and justifiably, most of the world was focused on the piratical attack of Israel on Iran, about a week or so ago, there was a startling attack in a church in Syria by religious zealots who claimed to be Islamists or Muslims, for example. And this should not be shocking for those who are following events in Syria. Recall that we've already reported what is obvious, which is that a stepping stone of Israel attacking Iran was the overthrow of the al-Assad regime in Damascus, bringing to power these so-called reformed Islamists, so-called reformed ISIS and al-Qaeda elements, led by the de facto leader, Mr. al-Shara, Mr. al-Jilani. And what I find interesting about the United States of America is that it's almost like a fashion statement for those who profess to be Christians to wear the sign of the cross as a necklace around their neck. Caroline Leavitt, the spokesperson in the White House for Mr. Trump, she wears one on a regular basis. I've seen the hip-hop mogul Sean Combs wear it as an earring. And so one would think that when their fellow co-religionists, Christians, are massacred for being Christians, that they would be speaking out. Perhaps I'm being naive to think that they're thinking in such a manner, but I've been really overwhelmed by the deafening silence with regard to the massacring of Christians by a regime that, at least in a de facto sense, is recognized by the United States of America and certainly is supported by U.S. allies, particularly the Gulf monarchies, particularly fellow NATO allies, Turkey or Turkey. And by the way, I'm conjuring up a new study, a new book that deals with the relationship of Ottoman Turkey, that is to say, a pre-World War I Turkey with the United States. Particularly, I suspect that the flowering of Islam amongst Black Americans is not only based upon the fact that during the unlimited African slave trade, many of the Africans carried across the Atlantic had roots in Islamic Africa, such as what is now Guinea-Conakry, for example, but also the fact of the administrations of Ottoman Turkey, which was a major power for hundreds of years up until World War I. And in fact, in a book I'm going to be writing shortly, I talk about how you had Ottoman Turkey diplomats who were complaining about U.S. racism about 100 odd years ago, before the overthrow of Ottoman Turkey. But in any case, back to the major thread, it's going to be very interesting to see if there's any self-criticism on the part of many of our friends on the left who backed the overthrow of the al-Assad regime in Damascus, Syria, not to mention in Turkey itself, which, as noted, was a moving force behind the overthrow of al-Assad. And yet, now they're worried that if Israel is able to overthrow the regime in Iran, next on the hit list might not only be Pakistan, but also the regime in Ankara, Turkey, as well.
You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. I'm sorry, did I cut you, Dr. Horne?
No, you're good.
We have another question, Melinda. We have, I guess, 7 minutes. So go ahead, Melinda.
Yeah, where do we want to go to next? Did you want to continue on with Turkey and Greece?
Well, first of all, I didn't mention the so-called buster bust.
Yeah.
Bunker busting bomb, use the alliteration, mangled, dropped by the United States, which led to what has been called a performative attack on a U.S. base in Qatar by the Iranian authorities, although I think it was more than performative. I think it sends a signal to Bahrain, Qatar, and to the other Gulf monarchs that they need to mind their P's and Q's, otherwise the next Iranian attack might not necessarily be performative. Now, with regard to Greece and Turkey, it's very interesting because I think we reported that during the midst of the bombing of Iran, you saw a number of Israeli nationals fleeing to Cyprus, particularly Greek Cyprus. Recall that Cyprus is an island divided between Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots as a result of the Turkish intervention there over a half century ago. And that did not please the Iranians, to be sure. And the Cypriots need to be careful, otherwise they're going to be caught up in that particular conflict, just as we're going to have to watch very carefully the politics of NATO, not only with regard to Turkey, and of course it opened its borders to allow Iranians cross the border into Turkey during the height of the bombardment. But at the same time, President Macron of France called the U.S. bombardment illegal. That's his word, not mine. Simultaneously, President Macron of France has complicated, complex relations with Turkey, which manifested to a degree during the NATO summit, which we probably should talk about, which had these North Atlantic nations, including Turkey, pledging to spend more in their military, which is basically a massive wealth transfer from Canada, and Britain, and the other NATO countries to the U.S. military-industrial complex. In fact, I would say that a major theme going forward that we're going to have to explore is how U.S. imperialism is seeking to cut taxes for the wealthy and the billionaire class in the United States of America, and then expecting the Canadians to make up for the shortfall, expecting the NATO countries to make up for the shortfall. And I should mention in that context that Mr. Trump unilaterally suspended negotiations with the Canadians because Canada has sought to impose a digital tax on Amazon, on Meta, Facebook, etc., which Mr. Trump rejects. It's going to be very interesting to see how Ottawa and Washington resolve this dispute.
And you're listening to the Diasporic music on Black Power 96. We only have 3 minutes left. Is there anything else you would like to add? Go ahead, Melinda.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if you wanted to tie up the NATO summit, since we were talking about NATO. But yeah.
Well, yeah, they met in Holland and the Netherlands, and of course, one of the more notorious news items was Mark Rutte, the Dutch politician and now head of NATO, referring to Daddy Trump, which is, I guess, is his new name. I mean, it's really quite shameful, the obsequious approach of many of these Western European poodle-like leaders to U.S. imperialism and to Mr. Trump, including, as noted, contributing a good deal of their treasury to the U.S. military-industrial complex. But there are complications because, as noted previously, Mr. Trump wants to improve relations, we think, with Russia, although the European members of NATO, along with Canada, would like not to pursue that path. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how that eventuates. Many analysts suspect that the NATO nations will not be able to meet this 5% quota, spending 5% of their economy on the military. That is to say, transferring money to the U.S. military-industrial complex. And that will give Mr. Trump an excuse to withdraw from NATO, which would be difficult because it's a treaty organization. So therefore, it would be difficult for the United States to withdraw unilaterally, absent a two-thirds vote in the U.S. Senate. But certainly he can make life difficult for NATO by seeking to reduce U.S. contributions to the NATO treasury. So NATO is not out of the woods yet, but a footnote that is quite important is that there have been news items about the Western European countries of the European Union seeking to improve relations with the People's Republic of China because of Mr. Trump's stubborn approach on this tariff question. And that could be a real game changer if that happens. Likewise, we see how Canada is creeping ever closer into the embrace of the European Union. And I'm not sure if U.S. imperialism had planned on that eventuality.
And with that, I think we'll have to wait until next week to continue this, sir. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
All right. I would like to thank Melinda Francis, and I would like to thank Lisa Watson for doing her technical brilliance on the buttons per usual. And tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, I will be on the Carl Nelson Show. I will be closing out Black Music Month, and I guess we will see you in the whirlwind. And Melinda Francis, any closing parting words?
Yeah, I hope all our listeners stay safe, and yeah, we'll be in the whirlwind next week.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.